In the remote wilderness of Maine, three enigmatic women ran what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for more than 30 years. Over 600 women seeking spiritual healing crossed its threshold, yet fewer than half ever returned, and those who did came back changed in ways their families could never explain. One survivor's account was so horrifying that Maine authorities kept it sealed in the state archives for over a century. Tonight we pull back the veil on what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we dive in, know this channel is not for the faint of heart. It's for those brave enough to explore the darkest corners of American history. If that's you, subscribe and tell us what state you're tuning in from, because this story will test your courage. What makes it especially chilling is not demonic possession or blind fanaticism, but the cold, calculated pursuit of knowledge, no matter the human cost. Help me with a like and a subscribe to motivate me to make better videos, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. Masquerading as Christian charity, this nightmare began in the late 18th century, when the District of Maine, still a part of Massachusetts, was little more than untamed land. In the small coastal town of Millbridge, home to just 300 souls, trade and survival were daily struggles. But 15 miles inland, beyond forest trails once used by native hunters, stood a place that would soon become infamous. On a foggy October morning in 1798, the Ashford women arrived in a creaking horse-drawn wagon packed with mysterious crates and surgical tools that drew uneasy glances. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, elegant and imposing with silver-streaked auburn hair and piercing gray eyes, carried the air of a European aristocrat. Her refined English accent and commanding presence demanded instant obedience. Behind her stood Sister Prudence Ashford, pale, gaunt, and eerily calm, with deft hands and icy blue eyes that gave nothing away. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her Scottish lilt was as cold as the northern sea. Lastly came young Temperance Ashford, barely 22, hauntingly beautiful, with raven black hair and dark eyes that seemed older than time itself. Her beauty, though striking, made people uneasy, especially mothers, who instinctively pulled their children close as she passed. The sisters claimed they were Anglican nuns fleeing persecution in England, presenting impeccable letters of endorsement, later exposed as forgeries. Their arrival was welcomed by the Protestant locals, who saw educated, pious women as a blessing to their rough settlement. Backed by seemingly endless gold, they purchased 200 acres of forest from a destitute widow at triple the land's worth, ensuring swift cooperation from local officials. The construction of their sanctuary began immediately and baffled every builder involved. The gray stone structure rose 3 stories high, with walls thick enough to drown out screams and windows so small and high no one could peer in. The basement required unusual excavation and reinforcement far beyond what storage would need. When asked, Agatha merely smiled and said that true penitence required isolation. Spiritual healing, she claimed, was most effective when completely cut off from the world. Most accepted this explanation, though some whispered that the building looked more like a fortress than a chapel. The sisters supervised every detail, demanding odd modifications, drainage systems meant for handling large volumes of liquid ventilation, shafts that seemed more fitting for a laboratory, and doors with reinforced locks. From day one, it was clear the Ashford women weren't just building a sanctuary. They were preparing something else entirely. The building resembled a medical facility far more than a convent, and when workers questioned its unusual features, the Ashford sisters calmly explained they were standard in European religious institutions known for intense spiritual rehabilitation. Their confident, authoritative tone silenced any doubts. Among their earliest and most vocal supporters was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a seasoned circuit physician in his 50s with a reputation for progressive ideas. He was immediately captivated by the sister's deep understanding of female psychology and what he termed mental afflictions that most doctors barely acknowledged. In his journal, he wrote admiringly that their methods, while unorthodox, were rooted in sound science and decades ahead of contemporary American practice. They didn't just treat symptoms, they explored causes. But what Hartwell didn't record was a secret conversation with Mother Agatha. She offered him a deal: refer difficult patients, supply their facility, and in return receive a generous monthly payment and access to detailed case studies, an invaluable opportunity for any ambitious frontier doctor. He accepted. The convent's reputation spread quickly. Families as far as Boston whispered about the miraculous transformations these nuns performed, turning unruly wives, defiant daughters, and socially disruptive women into obedient, respectable citizens. The price was steep: $20 silver for a month, 50 for 3, and 100 for a so-called complete reformation. But families desperate to restore order didn't blink. The women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears represented early 19th century society's deepest fears: unwed mothers who refused to name their lovers' wives, who questioned their husbands in public, daughters who rejected arranged marriages, and women who simply read too much or spoke too boldly. Religious tension also played a role. Puritan parents sometimes sent daughters exploring Anglican or Methodist beliefs, while Anglican families disapproved of daughters swept up in Baptist revivals. But the Ashford sisters welcomed all creeds, with equal zeal, claiming their brand of Christian discipline transcended doctrinal divides. The first undeniable sign that something was terribly wrong came on a brutal February night in 1803. Young trapper Thomas Brewster had spent hours tracking a wounded deer through snow-choked woods when strange sounds near the convent caught his attention. He was no stranger to the noises of the wilderness, the creak of frozen branches, the howl of distant wolves. But what he heard that night chilled him to the bone: screams, unmistakably human, rising and falling in gut-wrenching waves broken only by weak whimpers before surging again into raw, inhuman shrieks. He abandoned his hunt and moved closer, heart hammering. The building loomed silent and dark, yet around the rear, a faint glow leaked from the snow-buried basement windows. As he crept nearer, the sounds grew clearer: metallic clinks, urgent whispers, and a low buzzing like sawing. Peering through the frost-covered glass, Thomas saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The convent basement had been transformed into a surgical chamber lit by dozens of flickering oil lamps. At the center, a woman lay strapped to a wooden table, her head clamped in a brutal-looking metal device. Her scalp was partially shaved, revealing black ink markings and a raw opening in her skull. Sister Prudence, usually so silent and composed, hovered over the patient with a long, thin metal rod, her face flushed with eerie focus. Nearby, Mother Agatha calmly jotted notes, as if she were observing a routine experiment. The woman on the table was screaming, eyes wide in terror, yet her tormentors remained cold, clinical, and detached. Thomas realized with nauseating clarity that they weren't healing anyone, they were experimenting. Inside the makeshift operating chamber, novice Temperance stood beside her elder sister with silent precision, passing surgical tools to Sister Prudence as if they'd rehearsed this procedure countless times. Thomas, frozen in the shadows, watched in helpless terror as the long, slender rod was inserted deeper into the woman's exposed skull. Her screams built into a harrowing crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls, then abruptly stopped as she lost consciousness. But the sisters didn't pause or react. They simply continued their work, calm and methodical, as if her silence meant nothing more than another step in the process. Unable to endure the horror any longer, Thomas fled into the night, crashing through snowdrifts. With panic clawing at his chest, the image of that sterile, candlelit basement forever seared into his mind. The next morning he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, wild-eyed and rambling about torture brain surgery, and something that sounded more like medieval butchery than modern medicine. His father, a hardened man who valued order and reputation, listened carefully. At first he dismissed it as hysteria, brought on by isolation and exhaustion, but the details were too precise. Thomas described the room, the layout, the instruments, even the demeanor of the women performing the operation, with a clarity no imagined dream could match. Concerned but wary, the elder Brewster turned to Deacon Morrison, the most respected voice in town. Morrison, a man known for his balance and judgment, took the boy's story seriously enough to act, but discreetly. He arranged a visit to the convent under the guise of planning a community fundraiser. Mother Superior Agatha received him graciously in a solemn parlor, adorned with religious paintings and a towering crucifix, her demeanor serene and welcoming. When the deacon carefully brought up rumors of strange noises at night, she replied without hesitation. The sisters, she explained, often conducted late-night spiritual interventions for deeply troubled souls, women plagued by pride, lust, rebellion. Their cries, she said, were not from suffering, but from the purging of inner demons through sacred discipline. Her words were so articulate, so steeped in religious doctrine, that Morrison found himself almost believing her. She led him through the convent's upper floors, showing sparsely furnished dormitories where women sat quietly in prayer. They appeared peaceful, yet something was wrong. Their movements were too controlled, their expressions vacant, their eyes unfocused, as though they were seeing something invisible or nothing at all. When Morrison asked to see the lower levels, Agatha declined with a modest smile, explaining that the basement chambers were reserved for intensive spiritual treatments inappropriate for male visitors. Her explanation fit the customs of the time, and the deacon left the convent outwardly reassured. But as he rode home, a gnawing unease took root. The women's unnatural stillness, their lifeless eyes, the faint but unmistakable odor of blood, and antiseptic masked beneath incense. It all reminded him of wartime hospitals where suffering clung to the walls like fog. Days later, the convent quietly began implementing stricter security. Whatever Thomas had seen, whatever questions the deacon had dared to ask, the sisters responded not with retreat, but with even deeper secrecy. And from that day forward, the screams that once pierced the Maine forest in the dead of night fell disturbingly silent. The chilling screams that once echoed from the convent each night had been replaced by a silence so deep and unnatural it was almost worse. Yet families continued sending their daughters, wives, and sisters into the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears, lured by the sisters' increasingly refined promises of transformation. But sharp-eyed residents began to notice troubling patterns. The women who returned weren't merely reformed. They were hollowed out, fundamentally changed in ways no one could explain. Take Mary Prescott, once known for her lively spirit, clever tongue, and refusal to settle for a life of submission. Her independence had scandalized the town and shamed her family, who eventually delivered her to the convent for a 6-month spiritual realignment. When she returned, she was unrecognizable. Docile, quiet, expressionless Mary spoke only when spoken to, agreed to marry the first man who asked, and showed no emotion toward the life ahead of her. Her parents were first relieved, then unnerved. She no longer recognized her favorite meals, her childhood belongings, or even her closest friends. When shown letters she had written before she studied them, like the words of a stranger. Most disturbing of all, she felt nothing, no laughter, no sorrow, no anger. Dr. Hartwell declared her cured. The rebellious impulses had been purged, and she was now a model candidate for marriage and motherhood. But her mother noticed strange scars hidden beneath her hair, arranged in a way that suggested careful, deliberate surgery. When asked, Mary simply said she remembered nothing, only that she had prayed very hard to be a better woman. She wasn't alone. More women came back just like her, Hannah Morse, whose child had died in infancy, was sent to the convent after falling into a deep depression. She returned 3 months later disturbingly cheerful and claimed never to have had a child. When handed the baby's toys, she held them with polite confusion. Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife who had threatened to leave her cheating husband, was forcibly committed. When she came back, she denied everything, said her marriage was perfect and her husband was an honorable man. She suffered headaches, memory lapses, and disorientation. She couldn't remember old friends, got lost in familiar places, and struggled with simple tasks. She too had those same surgical scars and no memory of how they got there. Still, Dr. Hartwell praised the convent's work with increasing fervor, even as his own stability frayed. He began drinking, speaking in fragmented thoughts about science, sacrifice, and human advancement. His journals from this period, found after his death, paint a portrait of a man spiraling between awe and horror. The procedures he wrote defied every ethical boundary, yet produced undeniable results. The sisters had perfected the ability to erase memories, rewire behaviors, and suppress undesirable traits through targeted brain surgery. Their records were flawless, their outcomes consistent. The question, he noted, was whether history would call them visionaries or monsters. During this time, correspondence between the convent and European institutions exploded. Postal clerks, paid well for their silence, still whispered about the crates of preserved specimens, surgical tools, and chemical shipments that arrived regularly. The sisters were clearly engaged in something far beyond spiritual healing. Mother Agatha traveled monthly to Portland and Boston, always returning with fragile crates and mysterious containers. When asked, she explained the convent was developing revolutionary new treatments for women's mental health, combining faith with cutting-edge European science. Her poise and sophistication made the story believable, especially in a town that respected both the Bible and progress. But not everyone was convinced. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had returned from the convent, disturbingly passive, began speaking quietly with other families. What she found was deeply unsettling. No one could explain what had truly happened behind those stone walls, and none of the women could remember. None of the women who had undergone intensive treatment in the basement chambers of the Convent of Eternal Tears could remember anything substantial about their time there, only fractured prayers and vague whispers of religious instruction. Martha Goodwin's quiet investigation revealed something far more sinister. Several women had simply never come home. When concerned families inquired, the Ashford sisters claimed these women had experienced such profound spiritual rebirth that they had chosen lives of silence and service, bound by sacred vows that forbade any contact with the outside world. Requests to visit them were denied with polite firmness, but the mystery only deepened. Wealthy families from as far as New York, Philadelphia, even Charleston began sending their most rebellious daughters north to the remote Maine convent. The promise was irresistible: guaranteed transformation, behavioral perfection, permanent elimination of all undesirable traits. By 1810, the cost of this so-called comprehensive reformation had skyrocketed to $500, a small fortune in those days. Yet desperate families paid, seduced by glowing testimonials and promises of restored social harmony. As the Ashford sisters entered their second decade of operations, they became recognized experts in the growing field of female psychological treatment. Their name carried weight not only in America, but throughout European medical circles. Their meticulous case studies, boasting miraculous success rates, attracted the attention of the most elite physicians of the time. One of their most loyal admirers was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, whose private correspondence with the convent spanned over 15 years. His letters, preserved in Harvard's archives, praised the sisters' clinical insight and unprecedented ability to produce predictable changes in personality through physical intervention. What Whitmore didn't realize was that he was reading glowing reports of what were in truth early forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain injury. The Ashford sisters had acquired a level of neurological understanding that legitimate researchers had not yet approached, because the sisters were experimenting freely on living human beings. Their methods were thorough, terrifyingly precise. Each patient was studied beforehand, their traits, habits, and behavioral anomalies logged in exhaustive detail. Post-treatment, the effects were recorded with equal scientific discipline. Sister Prudence became a master of targeted cranial intervention, refining surgical techniques to isolate specific brain regions tied to emotion, memory, or personality. Her anatomical sketches, discovered decades later, rivaled the work of renowned surgeons and included exact angles, pressure levels, and incisions used to alter cognition. The surgeries were conducted with unsettling calm, using only minimal sedation. Patients were kept semi-conscious so the sisters could monitor their reactions, asking questions, issuing commands, adjusting instruments, while the women groaned or screamed helpless on the table. Novice temperance evolved into the convent's authority on psychological conditioning. Her protocols included starvation, sleep manipulation, temperature extremes, and sensory deprivation tools, not of healing but of complete mental breakdown and reconstruction. To bolster their results, the sisters experimented with chemical agents procured through international contacts decades before such substances would enter legitimate medical practice. By 1815, over 400 women had passed through the convent. The sisters' records boasted a 90% success rate, defined not by wellness but by the total removal of the traits that had brought the women to them in the first place. Those who died during the process were logged as clinical failures, their bodies preserved for anatomical study. Their ambitions grew bolder. They began accepting research volunteers, women with no family, no social standing, no one to ask questions if they vanished. These women, often prostitutes, widows, or wanderers, became the sisters' primary test subjects. The hidden archives uncovered long after the convent's collapse reveal a horrific treasure trove of medical data, exact skull measurements, tissue responses to various instruments, and step-by-step notes on how to erase memories or manufacture docility. The Ashfords didn't just keep their discoveries, they sold them. Letters uncovered years later revealed a thriving black market in forbidden medical research. Their clients included leading universities and institutions, too constrained by ethics to conduct such experiments themselves. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna paid handsomely for techniques to erase romantic memories, suppress curiosity, or create what he called obedient female subjects. Even the University of Edinburgh, ironically the same one that had expelled Agatha Brennan years before, unwittingly purchased Ashford research through intermediaries. They taught the sisters' theories in their curriculum blind to the horrors behind the knowledge. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the convent began taking commissions. Families could request specific traits to be eliminated from their daughters. Artistic inclinations, intellectual ambitions, romantic attachment, independent thought. Each could be surgically and psychologically removed for the right price. But after 2 decades of perfect deception, the Ashfords made a mistake. In the winter of 1818, a young woman named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent, and unlike the others, she was neither broken nor easily silenced. Her presence would unravel everything. Sarah Whitman was not like the others. She arrived at the Convent of Eternal Tears with fire in her eyes and a mind unbroken by shame or submission. Her so-called crime was refusing to give up the name of her child's father after an out-of-wedlock birth, an act that outraged her prominent Boston family, who had first tried to conceal the scandal through marriage or quiet adoption. But Sarah would not be silenced. She claimed her child, her independence, and her dignity, until her family retaliated by declaring her unstable and sending her north to the Ashford sisters under the guise of treatment. What they didn't but expect was that Sarah, 24, and highly educated, had read her father's medical books and understood enough about anatomy and psychology to recognize the signs of something deeply unnatural the moment she arrived. The women she met inside the convent were blank-eyed husks, compliant and subdued, their personalities wiped clean. Some bore scars under their hairlines, others struggled to remember names or form thoughts. Sarah knew immediately these were not the effects of prayer. During her first week, she was subjected to extensive measurements, behavioral assessments, and physical testing, all disguised as spiritual evaluations, but clearly designed to map neurological responses. The sisters were baffled when Sarah's resistance held firm. Unlike others who arrived broken by guilt and rejection, Sarah refused to yield. They retaliated with solitary confinement, starvation, sleep deprivation, and constant psychological degradation, all orchestrated by Sister Temperance, whose mastery of behavioral destruction was unmatched. Yet Sarah endured, using every moment in isolation to map escape routes, memorize routines, and document her observations using makeshift ink and hidden scraps of paper. Her chance came during a spring thunderstorm in March 1819, when basement flooding forced a frantic relocation of patients and equipment. Amid the chaos, Sarah slipped free and explored the forbidden levels of the convent. What she found was a hell beyond her imagination: surgical tables with iron restraints, scalpels soaked in rust, jars of human brain tissue preserved in chemicals, and stacks of medical records detailing intentional brain damage inflicted on women to erase memory, emotion, and identity. Each record included diagrams, surgical maps, and behavioral notes, as if the sisters were conducting a grotesque symphony of psychological erasure. Even more damning were the letters, piles of them, exposing the convent's transactions with European researchers who paid handsomely for data and body parts they could never legally obtain. With proof hidden in her clothing, Sarah realized she had only days before her own scheduled treatment. She had to escape. On a moonless April night, she struck a guard and fled into the forest. The Ashfords mounted an immediate manhunt, feeding the town a story about a deranged woman endangering herself. For 3 days, Sarah evaded capture, surviving on bitter roots and icy creek water, her feet bleeding, her strength failing. On the second night, she narrowly avoided recapture by hiding inside a rotting tree trunk, while search parties combed the area, their voices just yards away. By the third day, weak and near collapse, she was found by trapper Joshua Meadows. At first suspicious, Joshua changed course the moment Sarah began naming details about the convent only an insider could know. Her eyes were sharp, her voice steady, and her wounds real. He fed her, clothed her, and took her to the Millbridge Sheriff's office. When she staggered into Sheriff William Hawthorne's office on April 18, 1819, she looked like a ghost, filthy, exhausted, but unbroken. At first, the sheriff assumed madness. Her story of human experimentation sounded too fantastical to be true. But then she described the convent's basement floor plan with surgical precision, named the locations of hidden cabinets, and produced blood-stained documents sealed with the convent's crest. This wasn't the rambling of a fevered mind, it was the testimony of a survivor armed with proof, and it would mark the beginning of the end for the Ashford sisters. Sarah's escape from the Convent of Eternal Tears had done more than save her life. It had unearthed a trove of horrors that no rational mind could deny. The documents she brought with her, surgical notes, patient records, and letters from European institutions, were written in cold clinical language, but their contents revealed atrocities that would be classified as war crimes today. The first was a surgical log detailing procedures performed on 23 women over 8 months. With chilling precision, it documented operations that involved drilling into skulls targeting specific brain regions to remove or destroy tissues tied to memory, intellect, or emotional expression. Each entry contained personality assessments before and after the surgeries, and the results were appallingly effective. One case described Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old committed for excessive reading and intellectual curiosity traits deemed inappropriate for a woman. She underwent surgery meant to eliminate her capacity for abstract thinking while preserving basic domestic skills. Post-surgery notes celebrated her new docility, her vocabulary stripped to simple terms, her love of reading erased as if it had never existed. The second document was even more damning, a file of correspondence between the sisters and Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, who had paid 4,000 Austrian florins for detailed documentation on surgical techniques to suppress memory, reshape personality, and instill obedience. Zimmermann's letters also named clients in Berlin, Edinburgh, and Paris, confirming the existence of a global network of researchers eager to purchase human experimentation data they could not ethically gather themselves. But it was the third document, a patient catalog, that struck the final blow. Organized by type of treatment and outcome, it listed over 600 women processed through the convent since 1798. Most were labeled reformed and returned, indicating successful surgical and psychological modification. Some were marked permanent residents, their current locations unknown. Nearly 200 were simply labeled expired. Sheriff William Hawthorne, faced with this mountain of evidence, understood he was dealing not with misguided zealots, but with industrialized human experimentation. He assembled a 15-man armed unit and sent urgent requests to authorities in Portland and Boston for federal marshals. But the Ashford sisters had been tipped off. By the time the sheriff's force reached the convent on May 20th, 1819, the building stood empty, stripped of most portable equipment. What remained was worse than anyone imagined. The basement surgical theater was intact, lined with scalpels, drills, and other devices crafted for invasive brain procedures. Shelves held hundreds of brain specimens in jars, each labeled with patient names, dates, and results. Behind a false wall, they discovered 47 preserved bodies, each tagged with surgical notes. The corpses had been maintained in chemical solutions likely for future study. File cabinets overflowed with surgical records, correspondence, and diagrams. The depth and duration of the operation, over 20 years of systematic experimentation, shattered even the most hardened investigators. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, when confronted with his involvement, initially defended himself with twisted logic, claiming that the knowledge gained justified the suffering. These women were already lost to society, he argued. At least their pain served progress. But when shown the full scope of the crimes, the mutilations, the deaths, the profit-driven motives, Hartwell broke. Under guard in Millbridge Jail, he confessed to everything. He exposed the Ashford sisters' real identities, not nuns but disgraced physicians. Mother Agatha was in truth Dr. Agatha Brennan, expelled from medical practice in Scotland for fatal experimental surgeries. Sister Prudence was Dr. Prudence Ashford, dismissed from the University of Edinburgh for illegal brain mapping experiments on asylum inmates. Novice Temperance was the youngest, trained by her elder sisters to refine psychological conditioning methods meant to amplify surgical outcomes. In 1797, the three women fled Europe, assumed false religious identities, and established their operation in the Maine wilderness, where there were no regulators, no oversight, only a steady stream of society's discarded daughters. For over 2 decades, they operated in secret, perfecting the systematic dismantling and remaking of human minds in the name of science, profit, and control. The manhunt for the Ashford sisters became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, drawing in federal marshals, local lawmen, and even international cooperation from European authorities. But despite the vast effort, the three women vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the monstrous legacy of their work. Investigators discovered they had long prepared for such an outcome, maintaining multiple escape routes, establishing false identities across continents, and transferring over 50,000, a fortune in those days, into hidden accounts in Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Shipping manifests revealed that for months prior to Sarah Whitman's escape, the sisters had been gradually removing equipment and records from the convent, anticipating the collapse of their cover. Over 21 years, more than 600 women had passed through the Convent of Eternal Tears. Approximately 250 had been returned home, but now bore unmistakable signs of brain damage. 50 had supposedly remained as permanent residents, though none were ever located, presumed murdered and preserved or discarded when no longer useful. The remaining 200 were found hidden throughout the convent's subterranean chambers, their bodies partially preserved, marked with surgical incisions that confirmed they were subjects of prolonged, brutal experimentation. Each corpse, each labeled jar of brain tissue, each set of notes told a story of lives dissected in the name of knowledge. Investigators also uncovered a network of collaborators, physicians who supplied patients in exchange for data, local officials who looked away, and university contacts who eagerly incorporated the sisters' unethical findings into medical curricula. The ripple effect was profound. Surgical techniques and psychological models used in prominent institutions across America and Europe had roots in a horror hidden in the Maine wilderness. Families of victims faced with the unbearable choice between justice and social ruin overwhelmingly chose silence, unwilling to expose themselves to scandal or admit the truth about what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and wives. The conspiracy of silence led to the quiet closure of the case after just 6 months. Most evidence was sealed in government archives and would remain classified for over a century. Official records merely referenced 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility, omitting the scale and systematic nature of their crimes. Locals, hoping to erase the nightmare, burned the convent to the ground. Yet the sisters' documentation survived, and ironically their work, conducted in secrecy, soaked in blood, laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs in neuroscience and psychology. For Sarah Whitman, the trauma never ended. Though she had exposed the truth and helped identify victims, the burden of being the lone survivor who dared to speak publicly left her emotionally shattered and socially exiled. She eventually moved west to California under a false name, living quietly as a schoolteacher. She never married, rarely spoke of her past, and lived estranged from the family that once condemned her. Her memoir, written shortly before her death in 1863, remains the most detailed first-hand account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears, and serves as a crucial record of its atrocities. The Ashford sisters were never captured. Unconfirmed sightings placed them across the Americas and Europe in the decades that followed. 3 elderly women running clinics in Argentina, a French physician in 1856, reporting a private doctor in Paris whose methods mirrored those used at the convent, believed to be Agatha Brennan herself. But each lead collapsed into silence. The sisters vanished as completely as they had once appeared, slipping through history's grasp. Their legacy is one of science unbound by conscience, a perfect storm of brilliance and depravity. The Convent of Eternal Tears stands as one of the darkest, most systematic examples of human experimentation ever uncovered in American history, a grim reminder of what happens when knowledge is pursued without mercy and the most vulnerable are sacrificed in its name. The Ashford sisters ran a research program that advanced medical knowledge at a staggering cost. One paid in the lives and minds of over 600 women whose suffering was hidden behind clinical precision and the veil of religious charity. Their meticulously kept records revealed techniques and neurological insights that mainstream medicine wouldn't formally recognize for decades. Yet every breakthrough came at the expense of another soul reduced to data. This case exposes more than just one of the darkest chapters in early American history. It lays bare the deep vulnerability of women in a society where reputation mattered more than rights, where legal loopholes and cultural shame allowed three criminal minds to operate unchecked for over 20 years. Their work masked as medical progress reveals the terrifying ease with which noble-sounding goals can conceal atrocities. But perhaps the most chilling truth isn't what happened within the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. It's what happened after. The silence, the deliberate forgetting. Families, institutions, and government officials all made the same choice: bury the past rather than confront it. In doing so, they ensured the victim's pain would fade from public memory and left the door open for such horrors to happen again. This story forces us to confront a question we may not want to answer. How easily can a society built on ambition and appearance allow compassion to be silenced? Could similar crimes hidden behind respectable facades and justified by promises of progress still unfold today? History whispers that the answer may be yes. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it be forgotten. Share it, discuss it, question the cost of unchecked authority and what we're willing to ignore for the sake of comfort. Subscribe for more buried truths that powerful people tried to erase, and join us next time as we uncover another secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about America's past. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos.